All right, hello and welcome to today's video where I'm going to be talking about self-hate and whether it is natural or not. Whether we are naturally inclined to hate ourselves or if it's all nurture, something we're taught in society, something we're taught to do, and how understanding if self-hate is natural or not, can be beneficial for us on our path. Because again, the more we understand something, the better we understand whatever it is that we're dealing with, whatever it is that we're working with, the more we have the power to change it and to make it better if what it is right now isn't working for us, right? So the more we can understand our self-hate mechanisms, the more we can understand where self-hate comes from, the more we can understand why we all have that part of self that is the inner saboteur, that is the inner critic, that is the inner part of us that drives us to our coping and our numbing and our sabotaging, like I said. The more we can understand that voice, the more we can understand where that voice is coming from, the more we can understand what that voice is trying to accomplish, the more we can find compassion for that voice, the more we can find space for that voice, and then the more we can actually support ourselves to get the things that that voice is trying to help us get, okay? And this is something that I think is so important on the self-love path that I think gets missed a lot, which is, again, that every single part of us exists for a good reason. So like that, just that concept alone, that there is no part of us that is just there to be destructive or to be harmful or to be anti-life for no reason. Like it's just there, it's just destructive, it's like, right, the devil or the antichrist, the anti-life, negative, bad energy on the planet, and we just have some of it inside. I really don't believe that that is ever what's actually happening. Rather, we are all human beings who have a biology, who have a biochemistry, who have our genetic code that have evolved, just like all other life has evolved, to survive. Like that is what is at the root of every single thing we see in all life forms on this planet, is we are seeing a biological entity that is trying to survive, that is doing the best it knows to do in order to keep itself alive on this planet that is very complex and very difficult to navigate. Okay? So that being a foundational understanding, it's like, if we can embrace that that's always what's at the root of anything that's happening to us, inside of us, through us, around us, if we can start with that fundamental assumption that everything is happening because life is trying to keep itself alive, that is going to set us up to have a clear foundation for which to actually discover what's going on, instead of getting lost in delusion and stories and fantasies that are explanations for things that might make sense to us in our belief system, but that aren't actually true to real reality and therefore don't actually empower us to be able to make things better. I'm just going to ask if the sound is working. So that is, again, why we want to understand why self-hate exists and how it came to be. Because again, the more we understand it, the more power we have to create positive change, where what we're experiencing right now hurts, is harmful, doesn't feel good. Okay? So, again, if we can start to understand, if we can start to move from the foundational understanding, the foundational assumption that we can say at all times that everyone is doing exactly what they're doing, everyone is behaving how they're behaving, everyone is living how they're living, because on some level, right, with their conditioning, with their biology, with their programming, with their experiences, with the things they've taken in from other people and culture and society, all of this has come together to make it so that their brains, their bodies, their nervous systems are believing that how they're living their life right now is the best way for them to survive. That is why you are doing everything you are doing. That's why you have done anything you've ever done, and that's why you will do anything you will ever do. You are seeking pleasure because pleasure is the biological mechanism that comes up when we're doing something life supportive. Whenever we do something that is truly life sustaining, there is going to be a reaction of pleasure. Now, does that mean that everything that brings us pleasure is life supporting? No. We can have pleasure in terms of stimulation, in terms of numbing, in terms of coping mechanisms and all of these things that help us not feel the pain that we're in other areas of our life. And we can have these things that stimulate, dopamine receptors and that give us this feeling of pleasure in the moment that aren't necessarily life-sustaining. But again, it's the same biological system that's happening. So it makes us feel like we're doing something good and we're doing something life-sustaining, and then the body gets addicted to that. The body can be very interested in going back and back and back to that, especially when we don't have other things in our life that are regularly making us feel good, right? So that's the first thing we need to understand, is that every time we do something in real reality that is good for us, we are going to have a sense of pleasure while we do it, because that is how our bodies evolved. That is how we have, as a species, survived for so long. Having that pleasure mechanism tied into doing things that are good for our survival, right? For all these years and all these centuries that we didn't have scientific understanding about everything, that we didn't fully understand how the world worked and how we worked and what we needed to do to keep ourselves alive and all that stuff, we had pain and pleasure. We had pleasure letting us know this is life sustaining, this is life generating, this feels good. And we had pain, which was the opposite, right? Pain being there to let us know that when we're doing something that is self-destructive, that it hurts. That's the feeling mechanism that comes up to warn us that what we're doing is harmful. Okay? So if we can understand just the roots of pain and pleasure, if there were no complicating factors, which there are many, many, many complicating factors, but if there were no complicating factors, if we were just kind of having a one-to-one direct relationship with reality, and there were, like I say, no complicating factors in our intellects and no complicating factors in competing needs and wants and desires and all of these things that are a true part of our real reality, we would just have a one-to-one relationship, as pleasure being that which lets us know we're doing something that's life supportive, and pain letting us know that something is going wrong with keeping us alive. And at their base root, that is what pain and pleasure do. Okay? So if we can, again, start to understand that why we get addicted to pleasurable things that also cause harm is because that's confusing for our biology. That's confusing for our biology. The fact that we can do things that release the same feel-good pleasure hormones that are released when we're doing something life-sustaining, even when we're doing something that isn't life-sustaining, is very confusing for the biology. And then it's the same thing, that we can have pain while we're doing something that is truly life-supporting, and that's confusing for our biology as well. But like I say, so let's just understand that we are, just like every other living thing, a biological organism who's trying to survive, and we pursue pleasure and we run from pain because at their root, pleasure lets us know that we're doing something life-sustaining, and pain lets us know that we're doing something harming. Okay? So that's just kind of that, again, simple underlying foundation of how our biology works. Now, when we start to look at something like self-hate, and that voice in our head that tells us that we're not good enough, that tells us that we're shitty, that tells us that we aren't capable and that we're not good enough, that we're terrible on all levels, right? We look at that, we hear that voice, and we think, how could that be helpful? How could that voice actually be helpful? Well, I guess two sides of the same coin, right? Some of us hear that voice, that self-hate voice, and we believe what it is saying, right? We believe that when it's telling us that we're shitty or that we're stupid or that we're undeserving or that we're not good enough, all these things, a lot of us do just feel like that voice is telling us the truth. Like that is the reality, that is true, and that voice is there to let us know how shitty we are. And then we can kind of like maybe see that, like, right, that voice is trying to help me not be so shitty. That voice is trying to help me change and do better and be better so that my life will be better. And I would say, right, to a degree, that's sort of understanding that voice, okay? It's not a complete understanding of that voice, and there's so much more to it, but to be able to say, okay, well, that voice is trying to help me in that it's trying to make me less shitty, okay, right? Or we get into the self-love world and the spirituality world and the healing and all that stuff, and we're just told over and over and over again that that voice is bad and that voice is wrong and that voice is the voice of culture and that's the voice of, you know, patriarchy, and that's the voice that is not you and it's not really real and it's just indoctrination, and that the answer is to not listen to that voice or to ignore it or to try and get rid of it in some way because that voice is wrong and bad and evil, and that shame voice and that voice that tells you how shitty you are is bad, and it's something we need to get rid of. And it's even something that we can like see in the spirituality and the self-help and the personality world as being something that like it's like now this like new woke competition of like how much you can ignore your shame voice and how much you can say that you don't believe that imposter syndrome and all that stuff. And to a degree, I kind of feel like that's almost more of a delusion than the people who believe the voice is trying to help them by making them less shitty, okay? Because at the end of the day, what that self-hate voice is trying to do is keep you alive. That is the goal of the self-hate voice. And I know that there are times where the self-hate voice can be so anti to you, like so, you know what I'm trying to say, right? It can go so far as to seem like it's trying to not make me keep being here. And how could that possibly be that voice trying to keep me safe? And what we need to understand is that, again, that voice, just like we were just talking about, is interested in getting for you the most amount of pleasure it can possibly get for you while getting rid of the most amount of pain. Okay? Our self-hate voice does not actually know what is best for us in terms of survival, in terms of what is the most logical, reasonable thing that's going to keep us alive, as like just the most basic rudimentary keeping us alive. Okay? That self-hate voice was programmed within the context of pain and pleasure. Of pain being what's ruining my life and taking my life away from me, and pleasure being what is going to give me life. Okay, so the self-hate voice is not operating from pure logic, pure one-to-one relationship with what is going to keep me alive the longest. It's operating from what's going to give me the most pleasure and get rid of the most pain. Because to our biology, the most pleasure and the least pain is supposed to equal the best survival. Okay, does this make sense? To our evolutionary biology, how we figured out what was going to keep us alive and what was going to kill us was how things felt. The better things felt, the more we experience this is something that's going to keep me alive. The worse things felt, the more we experienced antagonism to our survival. So our programming, how our bodies, minds function through seeking pleasure and running from pain, is because when we had a much closer one-to-one relationship with nature, a much closer one-to-one relationship with the reality that we were interacting with, generally speaking, pleasure only came from the things that helped us survive better. And pain was a result of our lives being threatened or harmed in some way. So that connection of pleasure equals good, pleasure equals survival, pain equals bad, pain equals death, that is what our biology is going off of. Does this make sense? Our biology is going off of pleasure equals keeping me alive and pain equals killing me, because for most of human history, that was essentially true. Now we live in a much more complex, totally different reality where we have so many things that trigger those pleasure releases that don't keep us alive, and so many things that cause the pain releases that aren't actually killing us. And so we need to develop a higher way of perceiving what is keeping us alive and what is killing us than just listening to what feels good and what feels bad. That's why this emotional mastery work is not so simple as just follow your bliss and run from your pain. Because we don't live in that simple world anymore. We don't have that direct one-to-one relationship with reality. But our bodies and our biology don't know that, right? That evolution has not taken place in our bodies because evolution in our bodies takes a really, really, really long time. And getting ourselves out of the food chain and creating all of these things that stimulate pleasure that are actually bad for us, and all of these things that can cause pain and discomfort but that are actually good for us, that is a very recent thing that our biology is now interacting with that we don't have a context for physically. Okay? So that is something we need to understand. The self-hate voice is still operating mostly from if it feels bad, it's killing me. If it feels good, it's good for me. So when we live lives where everything hurts, everything feels terrible, where we're in so much pain and we're in so much just conditions that don't feel good, the self-hate voice that doesn't want us to keep living is trying to protect us from pain. That's why it's doing that. Because it's looking around and it's saying everything is a threat. Everything is destroying me. We need to get out of here. It's trying to protect us. It's trying to keep us alive through getting us away from that pain in the only way it knows and perceives how to do that. Right? And I'm not saying that that's like, these things are complex and there's multifaceted reasons why many people might be experiencing what they're experiencing, including brain chemistry being imbalanced, including physical things that have nothing to do with like our spiritual or our mental or our emotional selves. But we want to understand that, again, that self-hate voice at its core is trying to keep us alive. It's trying to change us. It's trying to motivate us to get away from as much pain as possible and to get towards as much pleasure as possible. Because that's what our biology thinks is going to keep us alive the best. So when we can understand that, then we can understand the next layer, which is that self-hate is totally natural. It's a natural mechanism that all of us have naturally, right? Because I know a lot of us are going to say, right, like self-hate is because of conditioning. Self-hate came from the world teaching you to hate yourself. And to a degree, this is true. Because, yeah, right? Like, a lot of people say, like, you know, like babies don't naturally hate themselves. Babies don't look in the mirror and think anything is disgusting about themselves. Like, it's not a natural thing for a baby to hate itself. Okay. Yes and no. The yes part is obviously the, like, of course, we can look at small children and they're very comfortable in their bodies and they're comfortable in their what, until they're trained not to be. But at the same time, we have to understand that, right, like none of us were directly told by someone, you have to hate yourself when you are rejected. You have to hate these parts of yourself that other people don't like. None of us were directly told that, like, that is a bad part of who you are and you need to get rid of it. Like, some of us were told that. But generally speaking, that's not how we're receiving the message that births that self-hate voice. Rather, in the temporarily codependent conditions of our early childhood, survival was dependent upon the people around us understanding us and meeting our needs for us. That is how we procured pleasure. The things that our bodies are biologically driven to seek, which is pleasure, came in the form of someone outside of us understanding us and providing for us. Pain, the biological mechanism that tells us that we're dying, came in the form of us not having access to a caregiver who was going to save us from whatever pain we were in. It came from that caregiver not being available. It came from that caregiver not having the capacity to do for us what we needed them to do. It came from all sorts of reasons, but from our perspective, it came from caregiver not providing for me, not taking care of me, not empathing me, not loving me. And then again, right, that neurological, biological connection of love equals pleasure equals survival. And rejection equals pain equals death. That got programmed in as our first program. And I talk about this in like almost every single one of my videos because it essentially explains everything about why we are how we are as adults. If we can understand this, we can understand everything about ourselves. Nothing has to not make sense. Most things. This explains a lot, okay? I know I like making big, general, overarching statements, but that's not necessarily true. But we can understand a lot of what we struggle with If we can just understand that our biology got programmed from the very, very beginning, so we evolved. We were born with that evolutionary messaging. Pleasure is good, pain is bad. Pleasure is survival, pain is death. We all were born with that. And then we were born into a temporary codependent reality where caregivers loving us, our perception was caregivers love me, caregivers empath me, caregivers give me pleasure. Caregivers love me, caregivers empath me, caregivers understand me, caregivers take away pain. That keeps me alive. That is how I survive, because I can't do things for myself. I can't understand my own pleasure. I can't understand my own pain. I can't understand my own needs. I have to be what they want me to be in order for them to do for me what I need them to do for me. That's what we all learned in our temporary reality of our childhood. To lesser and greater degrees, right? Because some of us had caregivers that were very able to make it known to us that they could be upset with us, or they could not like our behavior, or they could have a problem with what we were doing, but that they could still love us. Some of us had caregivers who were completely capable of communicating that message to us. So when we got disciplined, or when we were, told something wasn't good or bad or whatever, they helped us not go into shame, not go into guilt, not go into that's a bad thing about me that's getting me rejected by my caregivers and therefore is threatening my survival. Okay, that's where we have to understand the self-hate voice was birthed. When that didn't happen, when caregivers rejected us, when caregivers abandoned us, when caregivers simply weren't able to provide for us what we needed, when caregivers weren't capable of being there for us in a moment, when we perceived that our caregivers were pulling away or were mad at us or were doing something, even if they weren't in real reality, our survival mechanism kicked in and said, whatever you just did, that just threatened your chances of staying alive. Because you are fully dependent on this person outside of you, loving you to keep you alive, to give you pleasure and to take away your pain. If they pull away, if they are mad at you, if they don't like you, if they're not perceiving you, if they're not empathing you, if they're not available for you, you are now threatened. And if the only thing we had the perception of and control over was our own behavior, our pattern recognizing minds, our meaning making minds, which we all inherited as we were born as conscious human beings, started to make up stories about why that happened, what was happening, what the problem was, and what you needed to do about it. And that is where the self-hate voice was born. Anything that your child mind perceived was something you were doing or being or saying or not doing or not being or not saying that was getting you rejected or abandoned or abused by your caregivers. Even if, again, in real reality, you weren't being rejected, abandoned, or abused, it just seemed that way to you. And even if that rejection, that abandonment, or that abuse was happening not because of you in any single way, your child perception was going to tell you, that horrible thing just happened. What did I do to cause it? What was wrong with me? What did I do wrong? What was bad about me? So even if you weren't being told that directly, even if you weren't being told that's bad about you, you shouldn't do that, that's not good behavior, because a lot of us were. And that's how we developed a self-hate voice, right? If we were directly told this part of you is bad, this part of you is wrong, you can't do that, we perceived this is getting me disconnected from my source. And it's now it's bad. It's a bad part of me. I have to get rid of it. It's an existential threat to me. And then even if that wasn't directly being said, anything that our bodies perceived was something that was disconnecting us from our caregivers, our minds were then going to perceive as an existential threat to us that we then had to fight against for the rest of our lives to keep ourselves safe. That is where self-hate comes from. It's anything about ourselves that our small child perspective perceived as being something that threatened our capacity to procure pleasure and to get rid of pain. And in our childhoods, that was basically all funneled through, are my caregivers loving me or are my caregivers rejecting me? That is where self-hate came from. Okay? And then we live in a world, we live in a human race that is interconnected. So that self-hate voice that said, when you're rejected by the people around you, you are unsafe. You are going to have less pleasure and more pain, and therefore you're going to be less alive and more dead. That started to expand out beyond our caregivers to our social groups, to the other authority figures in our lives, to everyone around us, as we grew in our maturity without growing into more self-efficiency. Okay, so if we had grown up and we had been given more and more tools for how to understand what we want and understand what we need and understand how we can be empowered to get our needs met and all of these things, we would have developed less self-hate as we started to understand that we can be who and what we are, relatively speaking, most of the time. We can be rejected. We can be misunderstood. We can be told by other people that we're not good. And we can still get our needs met. We can still have pleasure. We can still start to rescue ourselves from our own pain. And then this codependency would have decreased naturally, as would our tendency to hate and reject and shame any part of us that gets us rejected by society. But for most of us, that didn't happen. For most of us, we just kept going with this idea that we're dependent on the people around us to keep us alive. Because again, that was the very base first program we ever got. And then the next, right, how you live, how you get a good life, how we were trained to get pleasure and get away from pain was to live up to expectation as much as possible, was to fit in as much as possible, which was to please those around us as much as possible, which means any part of us that doesn't fit into culture, that doesn't fit into society, that doesn't fit into the education systems we were in or the social groups we were in, the religious groups we were in, we already had the mechanism in place to shame and to guilt and to blame those parts of ourselves as being wrong, bad, and evil. Because that's what our bodies knew to do when we were experiencing rejection. When we're experiencing rejection, when we're experiencing not being able to go along with the crowd, the natural impulse is to hate that part of ourselves. Because again, in the temporary codependent reality of our childhoods, living up to the expectation of our caregiver was the best thing for our survival, right? As small children, we couldn't be like, F you, Mom. You can hate my behavior all you want. I'm going to keep being this way because I can be fine, right? We didn't have that independence. We didn't have that autonomy. We couldn't displease our caregivers and still get our needs met. And again, in some ways we could, and it wasn't actually in real reality that black and white, but to our childhood perspective, it was. to our childhood perspective, the best thing to do was be approved by your caregivers. Whatever you needed to do and whatever you needed to be approved of by your caregivers was the way that you were going to survive. So we all learned to reject parts of ourselves, to reject our emotions, to reject our thoughts, to reject so much of ourselves as a way of protecting ourselves from being anything that our caregivers wouldn't want us to be, so that they would keep loving us and they would keep us safe, keep giving us pleasure and taking pain away from us. There was that really messy time in our lives where being what our caregivers wanted us to be was the safest, best bet for our survival. So we learned that by living up to the expectations of those around us, we survive the best, which means we have to reject and hate and try and get rid of any part of self that doesn't fit into that. Yes? And then as we grew, we just kept doing that. We just did that with our teachers and our caregivers, and we expanded the circle of who we have to live up to in order to be safe. But we didn't change from I have to live up to expectation in order to get my needs met and therefore to have pleasure and to get rid of pain. We didn't evolve from that to, okay, now that I'm an autonomous adult, I can start to procure my own pleasure and I can start to fix my own pain with or without the approval or rejection of those around me, because I'm an adult who has autonomy in my life. Most of us didn't evolve to really get that. Most of us still feel like if we're rejected, if we're abandoned, if we're disapproved of by those around us and those we care about, we're not going to be okay. We don't have the full adult perspective. And then again, right, we do live in a world where we are interdependent, where it's not black and white. It's not that we can all just be completely independent and do whatever the fuck we want. Fuck society. And it's not that we're completely dependent on society and if we get rejected, we really can't make a living. It's somewhere in the middle. But we don't, like I say, we don't really perceive that and we don't feel that because we're all just so caught up in this program of if I'm feeling pain, if I have pleasure that I'm not able to get at, what's wrong with me? What did I do wrong? Who did I upset? Who just rejected me? And what do I have to do to fix it? That's the natural mechanism we all have at this point, unless we're really doing this self-love work, or unless we really got empowered by our caregivers to see reality for how it really is and to really understand our own needs and our own desires and what's actually going on and how we actually feel. Most of us, when we feel pain, the automatic assumption is to try to start to fix ourselves. Right? Fix our bodies, find our purpose, do whatever is that natural coping mechanism for when we feel pain. What's our scapegoat? We all have a scapegoat. We all have a thing we naturally go to. This is the reason. I don't have the right job. I don't have the right partner. I don't have the right body. We all have that scapegoat, that thing we blame when we feel pain that is coming from that self-hate voice that is saying the only reason you're experiencing pain is because someone didn't love you. Because it's through not being loved that you don't get your needs met. Or it's through being loved that you get pleasure. So anytime you're not feeling pleasure or anytime you're feeling pain, your body's immediately going to look for who did I just disappoint and what do I need to do to get back in their good books. And that's what that self-hate voice is doing. That self-hate voice is trying to help you find the thing you just did wrong. That got you rejected, that got you abandoned, right? And it'll be programs from your childhood. Everything that your caregiver rejected in you that now literally has no bearing on your life, you still feel when you stub your toe. It's because I'm not living my purpose. Like, it won't be that direct, but if you start to look at your pain, every time you come to that thing of like, I need to fix myself, I would question you. What just hurt? What just hurt you? Where did you feel pleasure go away? Where did you feel pain come in? And why was the automatic assumption that there's something wrong with you? And where did that story start? The story that you have about what is wrong with you, where did that come from? Where did you learn that this part of you that you're hating right now is an existential threat to you via it getting you rejected by the people you depended upon? This is where we have to start to really get deep into this. That self-hate voice is trying to keep you alive by trying to help you figure out where you just got rejected or abandoned, so that it can try to help you get back in line with your conditioning so that you will be approved of, and then you will change. How do we disconnect the stories? Deconstruct the stories. Yes. So that's what the self-love path is, right? I know I'm making it sound so easy and so straightforward, but this is what this work is. This is why my mystery school that I have is 300 lessons, because really getting deep into our shame and into our guilt and into our blame stories takes a long time, because again, right, our nervous system is so wired to go down these repetitive paths. I got hurt, this is what's wrong with me. I got hurt, this is what's wrong with me. Because again, we evolved from humans who were able to hear a rustle in the bush and to run up the tree. Okay, so like how we survived was having automatic responses to perceived threat. That's how our species became so successful. When our ancestors did something in response to a perceived threat and survived, the body and the mind programmed that in as being the answer that saved their life. So now every time a person hears a rustle in the bush, whether that rustle is a lion or a muskrat or the wind, their automatic reaction is their body's going to run them up the tree. Because the last time it was really a lion and they ran up the tree, they survived. So perceived threat, this is my response. It becomes automatic so that we don't have to think about it every time. And that's how our systems, that's how our bodies survived. So now we have that. So this is my answer to your question, right? Whenever we go into that self-hate, the first step is to catch it and see it. That was my automatic response. That was my automatic reaction. That was my body trying to keep me alive. Every time I was a child, I perceived threat. I did this, and because I didn't die, my body now thinks this is what saved my life. So, right, for all of us who are adults now, who every time we feel pain, we go, I gotta find my purpose. We might think, what? My childhood self wouldn't have done that. That's not how my childhood self survived. So how did that come from my childhood? But still, if we go back far enough, we will look and we will see that what our caregivers approved of, what our caregivers wanted us to be, the expectation our caregivers had of us, was to do something with our lives. You needed to be productive. You needed to be this way. You needed to be that way. And we learned that really early on, that these are the things that my caregivers approve of. So when I'm not being productive, when I'm not being purposeful, when I don't have a thing I can show them that I'm being successful, I'm failing, because that is how they disapprove of me, and therefore how I perceive that then I am not safe. So now every time I feel pain, I think I got to get my purpose. And it makes perfectly logical sense to me that the reason I'm in pain right now is because I don't have my purpose. I can figure out all the ways in which that is actually true. Right? Because our minds fill in the gaps for us. We have this biological program that's just, I'm not living up to a caregiver's expectation. So I need to change myself in whatever way that they expected me to be in order for me to be safe. But that's not the story we're going to tell ourselves. The story we're going to tell ourselves is, see, if I had my purpose, I wouldn't be rejected by my lover, and I'd have more money, and I'd have all these things that I want. We're not seeing that at the root it's coming from, I feel pain, I don't feel pleasure, what did my caregivers want from me? So we have to be able to catch ourselves, and then to catch our stories, and then to have compassion and curiosity. because it's not going to be so obvious. To us, it's not going to be obvious because we have years and years of programming and feeling on top of it, right? That shame and that guilt that come in and are like, no, this is bad. This is wrong. It's not just an intellectual thing. It's emotional. Yeah? Okay, why are you inside of my mind right now? Because you are a human like the rest of us. And we are all dealing with this. So that's why I say it's not so simple. And that's why I say, like, my mystery school, I wanted to make this, like, as straightforward as I possibly could. And I outlined it. That's the exact thought pattern. Yeah. Because it's not that unique. None of us have something that's actually totally unique to us. We're all running on the same survival mechanisms, the same patterns. Different stories, different words, different topics. But it's all just, what do I need to do so that my caregivers will approve of me? Because that's what I learned is what keeps me safe. And what part of myself do I have to reject and do I have to abandon, and what part of myself do I have to fix to get into their good books so that they will provide for me? And then even when we're adults, we don't see. That's not how I get my needs met now. How I get my needs met now is by interacting with reality. By understanding, what do I need? Why am I actually in pain? What's actually hurting? What would actually fix it? That's a whole other thing. But first we have to get through this shame and this guilt thing that keeps us in these loops of automatic reaction response, trying to fix ourselves every time we feel pain. And that's why I say, right, the first steps are always compassion and curiosity. When you start to have that self-hate voice, now you are armed with this information. You might not know where that voice is coming from. You might not know why you're actually in pain, what you need to do, what is actually happening, all that stuff. All you know is you feel shitty, you feel shameful, you feel guilty, and you feel like you know what you need to fix about yourself in order to make it better. That's the first step of awareness. And then the pattern interrupt is to say, okay, where can I just have compassion for myself? This isn't my fault. There isn't something wrong with me. This self-hate voice is just trying to keep me alive. So how can I just have compassion for myself? Right? And then we start to get curious about where the pain is actually coming from. What actually just happened? What actually hurts? What's actually going wrong? And is being approved of by someone outside of us actually the solution? Or is it something else? So like I say, I have lots and lots of videos on my YouTube channel to help with this. It's a practice. It's practice and practice and practice. Learning how to feel our shame and our guilt and to question those stories. Learning how to go deeper into where our pain is actually coming from. Learning to challenge our coping and numbing and self-sabotaging as being something wrong and bad with us, but rather looking for how it's helping us. What needs are these things meeting? What are these things helping me avoid? Like, it's deep. That's why I say, that's why the mystery school is so long. Because this isn't simple. But we can start with simple stuff. We start with that awareness. We start with that compassion for ourselves, right? This voice is not trying to kill me, and it's not right. It's just trying to keep me safe based on my conditioning and my programming. And it's come up with a lot of more mature stories that seem to match my current reality. But that doesn't mean that those stories are true. And that doesn't mean that there's actually some bad part of me. Right? It's deep. But this is why I would say that the self-hate voice is natural in this world where we aren't taught how to identify what we actually need, what we actually want, and how to get it in real reality. We're still living in our codependencies. Okay, I've been watching your YouTube channel since 2015, but I wasn't truly ready to face reality until recently. We'll be joining the mystery school. Okay, cool. I'd love to have you. And yeah, because again, right, like this is hard. As ironic as it is, a lot of the time people really want to just hold on to their shame and their guilt, and that there's just something wrong and bad with them that they can get rid of? Because that is so much easier, if it were true, than everything I just said. Right? Like, this is why the self-love work is just not popular. It's not flashy. It's not probably ever going to be big business because it's not simple. It's not straightforward. It's like a lot of uncomfortable work. The self-help and the self-improvement industry sells quick solutions because that's what we want to hear is true. They tell you you're just shitty. You just need to get rid of your voice. Just dress up that voice in a silly hat in your head and just don't listen to it. And we want to believe that that's true. Or we really want to believe that there's just a bad part of us, that if we do enough spiritual practice and we do enough, cleansing and healing and all that stuff, we can get rid of it. Right? And so again, even all throughout history, we've been projecting that which we didn't understand and that which seemed to threaten our survival as evil. We've been projecting the perfect caregiver, the all-knowing, all-powerful caregiver, onto God, onto the universe, onto nature, calling it all sorts of different religions and all sorts of different names, and saying that is like that parent that we need to live up to and sacrifice to properly, or do the things that the religion says we need to do to please the God or the entity or the superstition or nature, and then it will reward us with pleasure and take away pain. Right? It's just this constant looking for that benevolent caregiver, looking for the caregiver, looking for what we need to do to live up to the caregiver's expectation so that the caregiver will always give us pleasure and always take away our pain. That's what we're doing as human beings. We want to believe that we can perfect ourselves or figure out the right rules or figure out the right way of being so that we never have to have pain again, because the benevolent caregiver, society, God, whatever we're thinking it is right now, approves of us forever. That's why we're all so afraid of being rejected, because this is where it comes from. Because in the temporary codependent reality of our childhoods, with the temporary understanding we had, it really looked like our caregivers were capable of all pleasure giving and taking away all pain, and the only reason they wouldn't do that was because of our behavior. And that is where everything that we're living in as a culture basically comes from. All religions, all superstitions, all self-hate, all self-improvement, all of the spirituality. It's all us trying to perfect ourselves so that we never have to experience pain and can only have pleasure ever again. So we want to believe there's just a bad part of me that when I get rid of it, society, my caregivers, God will approve of me finally, and then they will give me everything I want and everything I need and take away all pain. But that's not how life works. There's cause and effect. It's very complicated. We're never going to get to a place. The American dream, yes, absolutely. But we're never going to get to a place where pain never exists again. We're never going to get to a place where we're in complete control of all of our pain, right? Like, this is another thing that the New Age community does not want to accept, that we live in a system, that we're born into bodies we didn't choose, that not everything is within our control, that not everything is because of us, right? The New Age spirituality world wants to tell you that everything in your life is energy based on your manifestation. No, it isn't. Life was happening way before you existed, way before humans existed. If life was simply happening because of our thought patterns and our vibration, who was manifesting? What was manifesting? All of life happening before humans existed. Right? Reality is not human-centric. Reality is not you-centric. That is the childhood perspective. Our child perspective was, reality is centered around me. Caregivers are only ever doing what they're doing because of me. It's all in response to me. That's what that is coming from. And all pleasure happens because I did the right thing, and all pain happens because I did the wrong thing. So again, because we live in a cause and effect universe, there is some truth to that. We absolutely have control over some of our pain and some of our pleasure via understanding the mechanisms of reality. And yes, sometimes we understand culture, sometimes we understand social groups. We can get our needs met that way. But it's far more complex than just what do I need to fix about myself so that I'll fit in. But that's what your self-hate voice is trying to do. That's all it is trying to do. It's trying to help you procure pleasure and escape pain via making you fit in to whatever you think you need to fit into to feel like you're being approved of by the people who have power. That's what your self-hate voice is doing. So self-hate was natural when we experienced pain as completely, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago people who didn't have science, who didn't understand cause and effect, all of that stuff. They would have hated any part of themselves that they perceived to be the reason why they were in pain or the reason why pleasure wasn't happening. They were projecting just as much as we are projecting. But we can stop that now. We can have a higher understanding of that self-hate voice is coming from my projection, that everything is about me and everything is because of me, and that this is what I have to do to measure up to the outside circumstances, which will then give me what I want. That's where the self-hate voice is coming from. Anytime you had pain and your mind and your body then perceived that pain was because of me and this is what it was, that's where that self-hate voice is now going to, every time you feel that pain, it's going to come up to try to get you to do whatever you need to do to get rid of that thing, because that's what it thinks you need to do to survive. Remember, the rustle in the bush, it was a lion the first time. I ran up the tree, body perceives. Every time I hear a rustle in the bush from now on, the answer is to run up the tree. Even if it's the wind, even if it's a muskrat, even if it's just something I heard in my head. Your body's just going to automatically do that thing because that's how you survived. So now we have automatic reaction. As a child, you perceived caregivers were pulling away from you. Whether or not you were correct doesn't matter. If you perceived that your caregivers were pulling away from you or doing something to reject you, and then you perceived that you did something and then didn't die, your body then programmed that in as you didn't die because you did that thing. Even if that thing has nothing to do with why you survived. Your body and your mind perceived it. So now every time you feel that rejection, you automatically go to fix yourself. Because in your body thinks that's what I have to do to survive. Your body thinks the threat is real, and your body thinks that the solution that you did that very first time was the solution, whether it was or not. And then you're just going to do it over and over and over again until you pattern interrupt yourself. And it's hard because it's biological. It's feeling. It's not just thought, right? It's patterns that were laid down before you had your prefrontal cortex and logic. That's why we're all so dissociated from ourselves, because we're all operating as though it's only our adult logic that has anything to do with why we're doing anything. And it's that is such a small piece of why you were doing what you're doing that it's not even funny. And that's why these other layers of ourselves, our feelings, right, our somatics, our nervous systems, our programming, the stories we got before we had an intellect, we have to look at all this stuff. It's a lot. But that, boiled down, is why the self-hate voice is there. So it is natural. It's just trying to keep us alive. It came from misunderstanding. It came from less awareness. It came from a temporary reality. So that's what we got to work on. So how do we cope with our own understanding when the people around us might not? I feel like you could lose community. You probably will. I think that's kind of part of it. We got to learn to be okay by ourselves or with less people sometimes. Like, this just seems to be a part of the path. And learning to be okay with people not necessarily leaving or abandoning us and just not understanding and not approving, right? Like, that's part of the conditioning. Like, that's part of what we're talking about right now, right? The mind and the body truly believe that the only way to be safe and okay is to be loved and approved of by our community. When in real adult reality, we can be rejected by our community in some ways. We can be misunderstood by our community in some ways and still have community and still be okay. We can lose community and still be okay. Do you see what I'm saying? That conditioning goes deep. That if the community walks away, you're dead. The worst thing that could possibly happen is them not understanding you. Do you see? Do you see the pattern? Like, right, we were just talking about this. Your body literally believes, if those around me don't understand me, I can't get pleasure and I'm only going to have pain. Right? That's not true in real reality. That's not true in adult reality. That's childhood coping mechanism. So we got to learn to face those fears. Okay, again, do you need your community to fully understand and approve of everything that you think and believe and do? I will ask you that question. Do you think that you need that to be okay? Is there any possibility that you can have community even if they don't fully and completely understand you? Do you see the black and white thinking going on here? I either need to be fully loved and accepted and approved of by them, or I can't have community. And if I don't have community, I'm going to die. That's not true. Lots of people are friends with lots of people who don't necessarily share all of their viewpoints. And lots of people have less community than we think we need and are totally fine. This is what I'm saying, right? Like, it's this learning to step into the adult perspective, that we're not completely dependent on the people around us fully loving and understanding and approving of us. Otherwise, we can't be okay. Right? That's childhood programming. That's not reality. Okay. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you for listening. And again, the Mystery School is open all times. We're actually having our next meeting tomorrow. We meet once a month. And then there's just the whole curriculum that you have available to you anytime. And this is what it is. It's just this, and it's deep, and it's long, and it's a lot. And there's that. And then I have lots of videos on my YouTube. I try to make it as accessible as possible. And that is that. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I hope that was helpful. And I will see you when I see you.